Dungende, dungaden dombi, dombede. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it does. I'm entitling this podcast, Black Baby, White Hands. And I'm specifically speaking to, for, and from the one that I am. And I'm also acknowledging and speaking to all children of adoption, to mothers and fathers that choose to give up their children for adoption, and to the parents that are raising children that have come from another mother. And my hope, my intention, if you listen to an adult child of interracial adoption, my hope is that you hear and things land for you in ways that are nourishing, eye-opening, and I hope that there is some peace that settles really deep down into your bones, and possibly some information that allows you to move differently in your body and in connection with the ones that you love. So, let's see where we go. Before I get into my story, I have a recorded podcast that I had maybe 2 years ago. There's more details, but I want to start this session with a story. And it's happened just recently, and it feels like it's been the instigator for me to speak with regard to race relations and some topics that may be a little bit triggering for some. But again, this is my experience and my stories, and I'm sharing what feels like it wants to come through. So currently I am on a vision quest and kind of a last assignment in Mexico, in Chiapas, Mexico. And that aside, some of my sacred ceremonies and work with the land, that's another topic. But in this now, I'm meant to share an interaction that happened just a few days ago. I'm sitting on the bench in front of a huge church, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and just kind of sitting and centering in myself. There's a bench right next door, and I see a white woman and a white man, and I see this little girl of color, yeah. And usually I just kind of stay in my own zone, but the fact that they were speaking English, and pretty loudly at that, and I kept being drawn into the little girl, her energy, the ancestors and energy, the ones that were surrounding this little girl were really, really strong. Yeah, and then they even came through with some messages for me. But as I was listening to the parents talking, this white couple, I kept hearing things like they, I can't believe they, and referring to the people that they were encountering on this trip. And then they were speaking about some project that they wanted to start. And then I even just was witnessing. I was just watching, just observing. And, if a child came up who is, selling things, there was a disdain in, especially the mother, the feminine, the way she kind of like, no, and didn't even look into their eyes. There was this shaming, shooing away, And then again, I bring back the energies of how they were speaking. And then I would look at the little girl of color who looked very much like could be any of the children that are running around in this land. Her facial features, in that way. And I was watching how this girl was looking at the woman, which again, I was assuming it was her mother, but again, I was just watching this interaction. And they were, they went on to speak about some things like where they were staying, and I can't believe they don't even, they. And for me, as a grown child of interracial adoption, there were many aspects that came up. Now, at this stage in my own life, in my own being, I didn't feel the anger. I felt just more an observation. And there's been some pieces coming in for maybe the last 6 or 7 months as I've been on this vision quest about directing my next parts of my path and purpose, And adoption has not been something that I have led with or a story in that way, because my work as a midwife and womb shaman and a world schooling mom, all of those things kind of took precedence. But the fact that interracial adoption is coming more into the field, and I'm meeting more and more people that are either adults or parents who are choosing to adopt children from a different race, culture, I'm feeling called to speak on it. And maybe, and I hope you can hear in my being, in my heart, that my intentions are good, and I'm not angry, and I'm not intending to shame. But these are things that are really important as I meet with other ones who have experiences of being raised by parents who may have some of their own programs running, usually unconsciously. I'm going to be fair in saying that. Usually it's unconscious and possibly even ancestral, okay? So back to this story. I'm just, overhearing and listening in the ways that I meant, and then also feeling called by this little girl and her spirit. So I stood up. And I introduced myself, and I said, "Is this your daughter?" And they said, "Yes, we adopted her, and she is her. From what we know of, she's from this land. We're not quite, sure of all of the details, but we wanted her to know." Her home. And they went on and on to tell me about, they had been there for probably maybe a week, and immediately thought of this project that they want to bring, and that this would be a part where she can stay connected to her lineage. And I had a really strong undertone in this feeling of this martyr / do-gooder missionary colonialism, savior energy. And the energy that I felt directly from their daughter, which maybe, if I'm guessing age, was probably about 7 or 8, as this little girl is listening to her parents and, like, here, this is your culture and we want you to see where you come from. And then in the interactions, the undertones, when I'm hearing, and I can't believe they don't even have waste recycling, and I can't believe, and they, right? And I'm looking at the face of this child who, again, is, I'm sure, absolutely loved, by her parents who have adopted her. And then seeing, again, even the abuelitas, the old grandmothers who also come selling wares. That's also part of life in the region that I'm in. And the way she turns them away and does not look at them. I watched the little girl's face numerous times as I was sitting there before I approached them. I watched her face, that here, this is a woman who looks like me, has the skin like me, or a child coming up, selling candy, selling something. And the way the woman pushed them away and did not acknowledge or see sovereignty in their being was extremely disturbing to me. And it did reflect it. There was many things of my own childhood and kind of the erasure of my being in culture and what blood and ancestors walk with me. Blood runs through my vein, and the ancestors that walk with me. And so I asked the mother, I said, would you be willing to take a walk with me? And, and I wanted to have a conversation without the daughter present. And then I figured if she, resonated in any way, she could speak to her husband and relay anything in that form. And she said, sure. And so we just took a little walk, and I, explained my story, that I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in foster care, given up for adoption in a foster care for 3 months before my parents, adoptive parents, adopted me. And I want to speak in these moments about sometimes some of the underlying issues and things, and this is why this interaction kind of stirred it in the ways that it did. I remember my mother being very clear. She was clear that, even when the social worker called and said, but, we never discussed this before, but she's mixed. I mean, they had all different kinds of names for children of color, mixed children at the time. I'm 45 years old now. And it was fate. It was destined. I was meant to be with them. But the theme and the energy that my mother, who is German American, I mean, they're both my parents are American, but in the sense of even immigrants in that way. I mean, their parents immigrated to the United States, so German, and my adoptive father is Polish. Their families, especially my mother's family, was extremely, and my grandfather especially, extremely old school racist. Just there's no other way to say it. And in many ways, my adoptive mother, following her heart to adopt me, was her part of being breaking that system. And again, I'm a mystic and a womb shaman in a different level, so I also have complete understanding of the lifetimes that I've had before with my birth mother. I will try not to confuse anyone who who's not familiar with some of that, but the whole feeling of she had this complex. She still had this savior complex. And there were undertones and things that I could feel from a very, very young age. Being thankful, right? And here's this, not much story as far as my birth mother at that time, other than what was from the social worker in the file. It was a closed adoption. But the energy that my mom brought forth very often was of this savior, like this do-good. Yeah. And again, there's an expression that is, it's like, I know that you love me, but do I feel loved by you? Yeah, that's a really, do I experience that love? And the undertones, of course, absolute, love from my parents. But their ways of loving were very different. And it lacked a connection to really seeing who I was. And for me, it was especially having indigenous blood and my own being, there was so many things that were running through me very, very young. My connection to ancestors and guides and spirits, it makes sense in the sense of my path and purpose in these now moments. All of it makes sense, and I am at complete peace with it. But if I'm speaking to ones that do have children that they have adopted and they are of a different race or culture, I'm just sharing some of these things to be aware of. Because as much as my own mother was, kind of defying her family was totally against interracial adoption and was really clear about, keeping the bloodlines clean and pure. I have a podcast that I recorded called I'm a Rainbow Bridge. And there's some more details, I think, in there. But there was things, as much as she defied her family, there was still these old grid kind of colonialist energies and things in her tone and her speaking, whether it was watching the news and that they kind of, the mainstream media narratives and things that I think even in this day and age, when people say like old school, like old school meaning racist, old school meaning erasure of, if you assimilate, you are, easily accepted. And there was lots of that I grew up with in the sense of things that were just natural to my being and spirit. There was a lot of shut that down. Do this. This is what it should look like. And then also going to predominantly white schools and just a whole lot of stuff, which again, the story in that way is not so necessary. But the fact that I had an opportunity to talk to a mother, which again, huge generations really apart, because again, this little girl who, it was her ancestors that were coming forth to me. And as much as she may not know her birth mother or father, the fact that every child, and this goes across the board on the sense of lineage, everybody walks with their entourage, their A-team. I call them angels, ancestors, and ascending allies, right? Every single being has those energies, and we become, and we are our ancestors. We bring them forth by our own embodiment. And so the fact that this little girl brought by her parents, well-intentioned, beautifully so, to a place where they know she's from, with a desire for her to experience her roots. I felt the need to speak and address it, because even though you can be really well-intentioned, it's those undertones, it's the language, watching your language, and seeing also how things are landing with your child. So as much as this family, and they were speaking about a project that they wanted to do, and clearly they have a lot of money, but I saw something else. I saw something else in this little girl's energy, and there was a part of me in my own heart that could relate to what she was feeling, and the fact that her ancestors spoke to me directly. Yeah, and they weren't speaking Spanish. They were speaking Tzotzil in this land that I'm in. Even when I head to the land and to connect, the ones who colonize the land maybe speak Spanish, right? But the indigenous Mayan population, there's many different languages. But in this particular region where I am in this now, the languages are people are Tzotzil. Tzotzil and Setzal, and I heard Tzotzil coming forth from one of the ancestors. I don't understand it, but I could recognize that. So anyways, I think I'm digressing a little bit, but let's go back to my walk with this, with the mother. And I appreciate that even the way that it came out, she was able to receive it. But when I spoke about, honoring them, of course, for their choice to adopt in general, because I do think that's really profound in the sense that there are many, many kids in foster care, adoption. It's huge, and I do think it is really important. And I'm not one that says, interracial adoption should not happen. I disagree. But I do think parents and the community should also be involved. And there's certain things to listen to and take heed of ones who've gone through these experiences and felt this erasure of who they are. And then the savior mentality. I felt that a lot with my mother, especially. My dad had a different frequency, but when I speak of lineages and everybody brings with them their entourage, their ancestors. For me as a child, I was very clear when there were certain interactions or conversations happening between my mother and I was very clear which line it was coming from. Yeah, because there were really some racist comments and even exchanges that we had. And in my being, especially being a new grid kid in my own right, and having a really specific path of purpose, right? There were things very young that I could look into their being and their souls, and I could see where they were misguided. I could see where there was still deep wounds. And that, again, is just a part of my path as a womb shaman and connected to my own lineage. But we had little things that kind of was like this undertone. One, for example, my mom had she had a lot of knickknacks and a lot of things, and there was like this Victorian-looking white lady with this umbrella, long, flowy dress. And then she had these two black figurines, which clearly were enslaved because they had chains around their necks and their ankles and arms. But every day I would walk past this cabinet. So even things like that are in the house, right? That you literally look at and it's like, okay, but I see my face in that. I would take these and she pointed them to this Victorian lady, like they were looking up at her and like, oh, she's so regal and beautiful. And they were like, on their knees. One was standing, one was on their knees. I remember it perfectly. And it was like this silent battle that I had with my mom, especially in those younger years. Every day I would open the cabinet and I would turn them facing away from this Victorian statue. And every day she would go in there and it was more about the hierarchy. It was more about, how dare you? Who do you think you are to touch, which again, I'm well aware of who was coming through in her ancestry, as well as how she was raised by her German father. Not so beautiful at all, loving and nurturing and all of these things. I get it, yeah? But it was this silent back and forth. And then even in exposing me to certain things like, here, this is your culture, this is your culture. She only offered books and things that were connected to slavery, or if I watched them watching the news, what comes through on mainstream media, it's the dangers of a single story. What was coming into their field, right, was not a full story and full picture. So what I received, especially as a child and through my white parents who adopted me, it's as an incomplete picture. And so for me, it was my own quest and my own path that took me on a journey to find and to go deeper. Yeah. I won't go into some of the other stories because I want to come back to this woman and even in this now. And as we were walking, I could feel in her lineage, as I mentioned to her, I said, even with the children that come, I said, I just observed your face. It was as ones, approach you for money or wanting to sell something. I watched your daughter's face, and they could be her sibling, her skin, her face, her complexion, and the way that you handled it. And I said, I don't say it to shame you. I'm just inviting you to actually take a look at some of these things a little bit closer and watch the imprint that it's having on your child. Because as much as you've brought her to a place I asked her as well, I said, what is your community like? What is her, does she have is there a Latin American community? Is there, who's around? Yeah, just out of curiosity. Because again, we were also just discussing as women as well. And she said, none, there's no one. So here's this little girl who has no connection to anything or anyone out where she lives at home. And then on this trip, she's feeling the comforts, maybe even the smells and foods and all of that is beautiful. And then the interactions that you have with local people. And even if they are, to me, there's homelessness and poverty, but there is also a spirit of free enterprise, in the sense that in that way. And so I still see every being as worthy of dignity and acknowledgement for who they are. And I said, the way that I see you kind of like shunning and not even looking, not even making eye contact, and the way that lands with your daughter who looks like them. That could be her grandmother, her abuelita, or her mano, or could be connected to her in some way. So here's this lofty energy in the white parents who adopted this child, and then subliminally, or these subtle impressions that happen that, to me, speaking as a child of interracial adoption, cuts really, really deep. Really, really deep, and actually can create some other things later, which maybe I'll get to in this podcast. We'll see. And as we were speaking about that, or I shared what I observed, she started crying, and she said, my father is the most racist, and she was talking, she had grief, and she had things that were needing to come out of her system as far as race and her family and her choosing. And so even that kind of this one side of really moving into a different realm and saying, I will not be like my family, which is a beautiful first step. And it's beautiful. I know that there is love and deep connection. But at the same time, kind of these microaggressions that happen and the tone and things like that. And while we were speaking, and she started releasing and really she said, she was explaining things about her father and how uncomfortable it made her as a white woman, some of his racist comments and how they were raised. And so I just brought to her attention that in that, so it makes perfect sense then why they're still on as a little, I don't know if osmosis is the word, but in it, even if it's not the embodiment of who you are. And especially the fact that she was upset, like when she said even with the children and the ones that came up, she said it just made her so sad. And so her not making any eye contact and her no's were very harsh, yeah? And as we were speaking about this, there was a little boy that came up and he was selling some things, and I just looked at him and I said, "No, gracias, precioso." And I touched him, looked him in the eye, and she started bawling. And she said, "How can you do that?" She goes, "Doesn't it break your heart?" And I said, for me personally, knowing the feeling of someone who doesn't see you in your sovereignty, that breaks my heart more. The fact that he is a child selling on the street, and it doesn't. I can look and I can see into the soul of a being, and still I don't have to buy anything. That's where, again, sometimes people, and this is maybe a general statement to people who are traveling and there's different places, it's not the opposite where you just have to go buy a bunch of things just because. But if there is respect and dignity in the transference of energy, that is powerful and a gift. And that's why I said, and she goes, "That was so beautiful." And I said, and for me, it doesn't cost me anything, but it's connecting that this could be my child. This is anybody's child, or again, the any person in that way, but seeing them with respect, and the fact that we were having this conversation, the fact that she has a child of color who is originally from this land, and seeing a different form of interaction taking place between this mother and the ones they come across. And then I also mentioned, and again, I said, I'm not, I said, you're grown, yeah, where you take for yourself what is for you. She had a huge release regard to some of the grief connected to her family, the racism that exists in her family, and then was also willing to listen to some of the things that I was saying. I felt her heart open, which is maybe why I even, followed the guidance to speak, because normally I don't. It's not my business and it's not my responsibility really on those levels, but because of this child, and I saw myself in this little girl to a great degree. And the fact that she had the ancestors around her that she had, it was also pretty profound. And I could see and also telepathically communicate with this child, which is a whole nother aspect of New Grid Kids, Star Seeds. There's a podcast that I have about that, if those words are new. But the fact that these children are, even if they have been separated from their indigenous cultures, families, traditions in those ways, it is absolutely possible that they are connected, especially if they don't have to go through the phase of disowning themselves and overly assimilating to be like who they're being raised by. And so that was the other point of my conversation with her, is that if she was only giving one side of the story, who is it? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is one who has a narrative, and that's a huge one. Yeah, the dangers of a single story. And she always says that it's not that the story is incorrect, it's that it's incomplete. And so as you're holding space for children of different cultures, adopted, in whatever way, it's important to have the full picture. Because even in this space and in the land that I am here, you may see what you see on the outside. You see there's poverty and there's homelessness. There's a lot of things on that end, but there's also a rich history of freedom fighting, of the ancient cultures. It has probably the highest percentage of Mayan indigenous peoples. And if you go back, if you want to bring and educate your child, please bring the fullness of their history. Yeah, and this is me speaking, and I can feel a little bit my little girl going, please don't assume and that my history begins, or a part of my history, because I'm mixed, that part of my history is simply slavery. That's not where it began. That's not even the truth. And for ones that are also you have your children, and here's the narrative, here's school, the education and history that they're getting in school is obsolete. It isn't correct. So that's where I also encourage ones to also go deeper in what that is. And so coming back to this woman as we were speaking, and she was telling me about, they so badly wanted to invest and to start a project here, and then that way there would be this connection. And she fully understood and received what I said about the subtle things. You can do it in a big way, but do like huge amounts of money and different things. But if you come to a place where this is where she is from, and it is her culture, and she sees and hears, I just reminded her to really watch and be mindful of her language. Yeah. The theys and the criticisms in that way. I don't know, with different things, it's a different place, it's a different country, right? So even that, I have issues with that in different places, and I've traveled to, I can't even count the number of lands as a midwife and traveling priestess, world schooling mama, right? I've been to so many different places, and what I've learned really is the ability to just listen. My son knows this. I always say, know your house. Know your house in which you live in, but also know your house as in the country. And be respectful and listen. Don't come in with this, colonial attitude of here, our way is better, and and then all of a sudden you want to overlay or whitewash what you have. Do you know what I'm saying? Without acknowledging or coming into a space and a land just with humility and learning. Because even when I was speaking about, and I'm not hugely, I'm still learning a lot about the place that I'm in, but there is such a rich and glorious history, pre-colonialism, pre-colonized, yeah? And that even that, some of the damage and what you see as a direct result, the poverty and things, is a result of colonialism. So it isn't just oh my God, look at these people and they and blah, 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 right? You have to look at the bigger picture. And that's where it's the dangers of a single story, and it creates stereotypes. And it's not that there isn't some truth to it, but there's also a huge part that is incomplete and not taking into consideration all of the things that led up to that. And so anybody who's also, say you have a child, and I agree wholeheartedly of bringing them to the place where they can put their feet on the land and to receive transmissions and the smells and the foods and the languages, all of those things, extremely important. But I think in the sense of investments in business, especially if you are not from that culture and you do not have any connections, because I asked her that. I said, well, do you have connections here? I mean, I said, it sounds very admirable, of what you're intending, the business that you want to start. But do you have anybody, on the ground already who is from this community and from this land? And no, the answer was no. And again, what I've learned in my travels and just in being, out of respect, it's best that you show up and you learn as much as you can and you listen, and you don't come in as this like white savior energy, because at the end of the day, there is something that happens when you connect in ways and you go to the community itself. And you may have a certain amount of money, and here's the intention, here's the vision that you would like to see. But, and this is probably as a midwife speaking too, if you go to the mothers and to the women and to the village elders and you ask, what is most needed? Yeah? How can we be of service? That comes from a whole different level of humility, of you may have this idea of like, well, we want to do a eco cafe, and we want to do blah, 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 blah. But the ones in the community who actually live there say, that really doesn't serve us, because our community wouldn't be eating there. We could really use some speed bumps, or we could really use a better system for the water, filtration and different aspects in those ways. But if you connect and you go in and you I wouldn't even consider anything before a year, yeah? And really making sincere connections, connecting with the ones in the community. So again, it was not for me to buzzkill their idea, and in their lifespan in general, they may, execute whatever they were doing, but it was definitely their idea was for expats. It was for people. It wasn't for the community. And so in that, I still worried about the transmissions. And then here, again, the language that I was hearing just in the brief conversations and the theys and, how they would execute their plan and their business idea, and then that would be a way that would continue to bring them back. It was just those two simple things, as well as just holding space for her to grieve a little bit too from the ancestry and the lineage that she came from. She was open to it. It was good. And again, normally I do not interfere. I do not step into anybody else's realm, but it was this little girl. And the title is of this podcast, I'm going to call it Black Baby, White Hands. And that is a book by Jaya John. And before I left the States this past, at the end of, I think it was fall, I went to the library because, again, there was something for me that was shifting and my own pieces. And I went to go get a different book. It was called Daughter, Drink This Water. And they didn't have it. And then it was like, but we have this, and it's Black Baby, White Hands. And I'm like, And after me kind of being also in reunion and seeing my parents after some years. And I want to say, that my relationship with my parents who adopted me, complete peace, where there is after 45 years, almost 46 years in the dance in that way, there is complete peace and love. There is no drama, there is no separation, but I also feel called to speak to some of these things because maybe it will save some of the ones who are being raised outside of their indigenous culture, or without being surrounded by people that look like them. And maybe there will be some things that are helpful by those of us sharing our stories. So even I'll put a link in the notes as well, and I have a blog as well. Just check out the show notes after listening if you choose. The other piece that I want to speak about, and this is as a child of interracial adoption, the other piece I want to speak about is the shadow aspects that for me took quite a long time to walk through and heal. And I share because I'm hoping that the generation next, and the parents that I work with as clients are phenomenal. The ones who are holding space for new grid kids, star seeds, they're amazing. And they really are ones who are making an effort to really to continue to grow, to continue to evolve, to also see their children as not, I've saved them from this life that would have been horrible, to also saying, wow, who is this being? And what is it that they're bringing by their field and their energetics to the family? That it's a reciprocal exchange of energy. In many ways, it's a sacred contract. And for me, again, my whole life path and different things, I have made complete peace with my path and all of that. And I am not someone who has ever met my birth parents. Now, on an energetic and the mystic in me and shaman, I know, and I have in my entourage, in my A-team, my ancestors, ones that have been with me from the beginning. And so I have a deep connection to my lineage and ancestry, and my path as a midwife and traveling, world schooling with my son brought me to all of these different places that could have even possibly been in my bloodline, first of all, and to connect energetically, just with the guardians of the land and the ancestors in those ways. But for me, it took a long journey of kind of making peace with my path. And my hope is that generation next, the new grid kids, don't have to search as much in those ways. And again, I want to bring in the shadow aspect of being raised by ones who were old school, undercover racist in many ways, right? And that may sound harsh, but I don't think it sounds harsh to people who are not racist, right? I'm speaking freely. And again, even as the intro in my podcast, I speak to, for, and from the one that I am. But what it created, the shadow that it created in me by not having anybody around that looked like me, and then kind of this energy of assimilate, be like us. Whereas literally, even as a child, I'm looking around, I'm like, my love languages are different, how I speak, how I communicate, my freedom of expression, so many things that eventually, after traveling and moving around, I went to places like, I'm home, whether it was with foods and music, even smells, very profound when you recognize and feel home, even in places that you've never been before. But the shadow that it created and what that looked like for me, especially if we speak about, do I want to talk about the abandonment piece, or do I want to speak? I think it's connected to abandonment, and we'll see if I can weave this together gracefully. Because I was always, it was like, we saved you, we saved you from, and I felt indebted. Here's this aspect of, here's your family and the ones, they must love you, right? And they adopted you and blah, blah, blah. But the complex that comes with feeling like they saved you, it created in me this, a sense of unworthiness that had me overcompensating. So in many ways, I feel like I became kind of this overachiever, or making sure that I was not a burden, and overly extending myself in many ways. And even in the house, energetically, emotionally, a lot of the things, I literally became this being who learned at a very young age. I will say that my upbringing was my training ground in so many ways, and added to some of the skills and the gifts that I have. but I overperformed in many ways. I think even as far as success and business before it was like I was very adamant about one, freedom. So for me, work and making money, and it was really important, one, for me to have my own home and my space to continue to evolve and grow outside of the family who raised me. Which also speaks about safety and safe space, right? Because you can, I think I mentioned it before, but it's like you can, express love in the ways that you do. You have a roof over your head, you have food, you have, all of these opportunities. But at the same time, if you ask the being, the child, or, even another person, do you feel loved by me? Do you feel seen and heard and validated? Those things did not exist so much for me growing up. So it was really important for me and my path to find ways. And so sometimes that validation, especially at a certain period of my life, was about success in my business, work and buying a house. And, there was a strong material side that came with that, because I also knew that that was very impressive to my parents. But there's the side of not wanting to take up space in a way or be a burden, overcompensating. Whereas again, my path took for me, and I think even in some of the things that I took on as well, even as a midwife and different situations where I literally overextended myself in many ways. There's also a saying that it's like, just because she carries it well doesn't mean it's not heavy. And there was a lot that I learned from my being raised in the way that I was raised, that I could carry a lot. And the empath in me, and this is where, again, speaking to the new grade kids and parents of new grade kids who will be coming through in abundance through the foster care system and adoption in the next 10 years. It's going to increase rapidly. But in that, there are many beings who, they are just these amazing souls. They come with such wisdom and such clarity. And so my hope is that in me sharing some of these things, there will be less energy connected to them having to do the work of kind of removing what's not theirs. Yeah. So the abandonment piece as well, I noticed for myself, the shadow aspect of that is that when I could feel that energetically in someone else's field, I had an extreme loyalty and an ability to not want to abandon them, to not reproduce that wound. And at the same time, what I ended up doing in many senses was abandoning myself. Because even as much as, there's a lot of people that I have been able to walk with and serve in different ways. There's many times where, like my own being, I literally, from someone who really thrives in like being in nature, being in like I recharge in my own energy field, my own frequency. A lot of times as I was working in different scenarios, I was giving so much of myself without being able to replenish, and to kind of download, and not wanting to abandon, looking at somebody's life and saying, okay, if I can help, okay, and then disregarding kind of some of my own needs and desires as well. So that kind of is a byproduct and a little bit of that abandonment piece. Yeah. And if it's any consolation to anyone who may be listening to this, any parents or ones who are adopted and kind of going through their own issues of trying to make peace with the pieces that are their life and the story and where they come from. It is absolutely possible to heal. It is not a wound that needs to be carried as throughout all of life. Now, I am not here to speak on anybody else's process and what that looks like. And I'm including, even in this podcast, I'm speaking to to mothers as well who are choosing to give up your children. Mothers and fathers, but there is really a specific connection that I have with mothers, and even in my work in offerings and sessions with clients, I have seen women who have come from horrible circumstances and environments in those ways that literally were able to connect with the spirit and soul of the child that they were carrying, knowing that they're going to give this child up, that is the choice, yeah? And for me, if you know me, I never, ever am about trying to change people's minds. They know, they are the experts for themselves of what they can handle, what their community, what their family, the support that they have, all of it. But the fact that there's women who literally are choosing to stay soul-linked and connected to the spirit and to the child, that in itself is a remedy to the abandonment piece. Because a lot of the ones that I've worked with, including myself, my story is a little bit different because I do energetically and psychically have this connection to my birth mother. And I do remember her and have had regressions where I saw her and felt her energy throughout her pregnancy with me, as well as her holding me in the hospital. And I know sometimes women are encouraged, maybe it's different in this day and age. I think I probably need to educate myself more. But for the ones that I'm speaking to, that disconnect and not acknowledging that this being, that even while they're in your womb, don't start grieving before the time. Really, really take as an opportunity the connection to this being, to this starseed, because they're coming in, again, new grid kids, starseeds, Generation Next, they're coming in not only with their lineage and the ancestors that accompany them, yeah, but they're coming in with such gifts. And some of the women that I've worked with, because of them not closing their heart and really opening into all of the feelings, you can still feel the grief that you feel, but don't allow it to disconnect you from being a sacred, holy vessel to bring this child through and honoring the sacred contract that this child has already made. Yeah, and even on a soul level, parents as well, even for the parents that are adopting children as well, there is a specific soul contract that comes through. And for the mothers in general, and because I used to be a massage therapist, cranial sacral therapy was one of my specialties, and I absolutely love it because it works with the nervous system, the spine, the nervous system. It is our tree of life, right? And we know that the mother is transmitting all the emotions, all the feelings, the experiences that she's having is being transmitted to the child. And so on behalf of children who are being given up for adoption as well, it is the biggest gift that you can give your child, that during that 10 moons, people like to say 9 months, but in reality, in natural birth, just in general, it's about almost 10 months. But during that time, it is so potent and powerful to make that connection, and your child will feel it and will take that with them throughout their lifetime. So this is where I see a way of healing pieces. Before they even, then there's nothing even to heal in that regard. That connection from mother to child, as well as I've had women who, again, they have this because they're open to this connection and really sending love, knowing that their energy and their thoughts are going to the child. All of these things that in them establishing those connections, that it's a stronger imprint. It's like it's a gift, an extra gift that you're giving to the child as well as to the parents who will be adopting the child as well. It's huge. And it is a powerful connection. I've worked with quite a few mothers who have chosen to give up their children. And in making peace with their decision, and then establishing and really connecting with the soul and spirit of that child, it is profound. It is absolutely profound. And then, even as a gift to the parents who are going to be adopting this child as well, there are aspects that come through, which again, if I'm confusing some, if this is out of the realm, because normally my networks and speaking are with midwives and birth workers and mothers, pregnant mom, but me really taking on and speaking about adoption, this is more recent. So if there's some words and things that are confusing, maybe check out a few of my other podcasts and there will be some more explanations. But I do think that if there's any consolation as well, that being connected to our lineage, being connected, because I know a lot of the ones in the community, it's like there's this hole, there's this grief and feeling disconnected. And why didn't my parents want me? I, for one, personally, because of my, I'm a lineage holder, and because of my path as well, I never felt that disconnection. I always, from a young age, this is why, again, I'm speaking about some of the new grid kids, because some of the ones coming in far surpass me in their gifts and their abilities, their psychic nature, their empathy, and them knowing what they're here to do, right? And I shouldn't even say do, because many of them are just holding and anchoring energies in beingness that is powerful. But in the sense of even why they chose to come to Earth and why they came, even to, in many ways, chose to be raised in a different environment and not by who they, all of it. There is also many times a sacred contract that accompanies that. And so even for parents who are adopting their children, I think it's incredibly valuable to really, beyond providing, a home and here my heart is open to love, of really seeing them. And I'm going to bring in the piece of religion as well. A lot of the new grid kids, and I, again, myself personally, absolutely carry within my being respect for all traditions. But it took my path of also being raised in Christianity and different aspects, and me also embracing indigenous practices and African spirituality and things that spoke to my soul, to my lineage, that made sense when I was doing certain rituals that I kind of did secretly. And then I traveled to places, I'm like, oh my God, and lived with and apprenticed with different traditional healers and sangomas. And I'm like, I do this all the time. Things that made so much sense to me. I speak to this on behalf of the new grid kids as well, is that they're coming, even if you have a religion. And again, my nature and path has been that I've lived in so many different cultures and religious, with foundations, whether it was Muslim culture, Hindu culture, Christian, and there's so many more. This is where I would say all my time, I think even in Africa in general, it was like this homecoming of like different practices and spirituality that has been demonized in Western culture. And it's just because it's simply not understood. But for me, in the root in my own lineage, it made more sense of combining heaven and earth and kind of reframing some of the stories. So I say this to say that some of these new grid kids will have a deep, they're carrying Christ codes, or Christ, which is also Krishna. They're carrying that frequency and Christ consciousness within their being. And I, for one, have seen in all of the different cultures and all of the different places that I've lived, even if they were practicing a different religion, the Christ consciousness and frequency it's a vibration. It's an energy. And it is global. Yeah, it's global. It's a universal energy. But they're coming in, if there's a really strong play, and this is where I'm speaking to some of the parents and ones who, again, I honor all traditions, and I do see a power of one that runs through all. But in the quest to connect also with your new grid kids, generation next, they are extreme bullshit detectors. They are ones that will question. And if you allow them, and especially if we're talking about interracial adoptions, if you allow them to explore their gifts and their lineage and the things that just naturally come to them, where they do not have to hide it. Yeah, I, for one, had a lot of things that were just part of my being. Yeah, that I didn't shut down, but I had to hide because of, and again, this can be old school as well. I do consider the fact that even my parents and the timing of it, maybe there's a huge difference now, but I do feel that with regard to that, the religious aspect, that there are things that come through their spirits and their indigenous lineages, and connecting back with their ancestors. And this goes across the board, of all cultures, because when we go back, there is earth-based connections, and there is stories and things that are a part of everyone's bloodlines that predate Christianity, and even I will be so bold to say that even Yeshua, or ones who know him, as Jesus, or the Christ, and his title in that way, is someone who traveled and went to all of these different places and cultures and learned and studied, and his gifts of healing, of telepathy, of things that were considered miracles in those ways. These new grid kids coming in automatically equipped with these things. And again, if I remember correctly too, it's like, and you will do more than these things, speaking in the voice of Christ, of Yeshua, that it's within you. And so these beings that are coming in, and even if they're choosing and have a path of different ways in which they land into different parts of the world, into different families. And that's also another thing when I work with some of the new grid kids and transmit messages in that way. Some of them, even before they are coming in, even the adoptive parents will start receiving these transmissions, and they will start receiving things in their dreams, and that connection, because all spirit is eternal. And so all is connected in that way. Sometimes they're choosing specific places in the land in which to be born. Things will start to shift in different ways as well, as far as family dynamics and all kinds of things. And those are things that I really hope that that parents and just everyone is really taking into consideration that there's a much bigger picture, and being a part of that mystery and serving that unknown and that mystery is just as important, by being open to magic, being open to things that are kind of unfolding in ways that seem not so mainstream, but following that, and then allowing the children as well to open, and to that it's safe for them to express the way they express. Sometimes even sounds and languages and all kinds of things, if they're not overly forced to assimilate and to be like everyone else, I think that will prevent a lot of time wasted, and them having to kind of reclaim themselves, I think that might even be a different podcast. And emotionally, I'll say as well, for me, there's transparency, that just being really, really, really honest, and things that you don't know. Or even too, when I began the podcast and started speaking about this family that I met, and the mother in particular, as soon as she got it, and she could hear in her voice, like she could hear with an open heart, like my words, she was able to receive into her heart. Which was fantastic, which was literally also a huge tribute to who this woman is. And her child being 7 years old, that her watching her language and just reframing a few things, and from the conversation opened up in a way that, again, if it serves this little child, which again, I saw, black baby, white hands. I saw myself in that. And I again, have made peace with my path. Yeah, I really see that my life, exactly as it has been, is exactly how it has been meant to be. Do you know what I mean? For me. But for generation next, new grid kids, and for ones coming in, there is so much more possibility and expansion. And like I said, not a lot of time being wasted on them having to go through, and even traveling. I mean, if that's, for them, the search to find themselves and to integrate their whole selves. Anyways, I just see it as profound. So anyways, I feel to end, I don't know if I covered all of what I wanted to cover. There was probably more pieces of my story, but I feel that in the ones that I work with and connect with, and even some of the ceremonies and rituals that I do, I'm being called to be a little bit more inclusive and focus more on adoption, right? And so probably some of my own stories will come through, and especially direct, especially as I'm connecting with ones who are, adults, children of adoption, which I know that sounds contradictory, but they were adopted. And especially the interracial piece, but really across the board, adoption in general, the ones that I'm connecting with individually, and when I do sessions, those stories and the things that are really meant for the ones that I'm working with, they come out there. So I think sometimes in a podcast there's a collective energy, and there's an intention from where I'm coming from and speaking, but the rest kind of unfolds in natural space and time. So anyways, I would like to end with a quote by one of my mentors, Shiro's Bell Hooks, who has recently become an ancestor. She says, "Beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation. By each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world." Thank you for listening to A SoulJourner's Truth podcast. It's my purest pleasure to share my SoulJourn with you. To learn more about the services and the offerings I share with our global community, please visit asouljournerstruth.me.